Labą dieną. Aš labai džiaugiuosi galėdamas būti čia Mykolo Romerio universitete. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your warm words of welcome. It's a true privilege to be back again here at Mykolo Romerio University today and to continue our meanwhile traditional NATO hearings. To discuss about NATO and European security is more than ever a must in these dangerous, dark and most challenging times for our continent since the Second World War. But before I start, magnificence, first of all, my highest respect that Mykolo Romerio University is among the world's leading universities with most impact in fields of sustainable development. So, the university ranks among the world's most influential universities in this field. I'm very pleased that your achievements are recognized internationally. Once more, respect. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has turned our worst fears into reality. It has opened the gravest security crisis in Europe in the past 77 years since World War II and threatens the global security. It has caused enormous human suffering and destruction, death and severe pain to millions of innocent people in Ukraine. Even the last one in Europe should have lost any illusions about Russia and its brutal President Putin on the 24th of February when Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian borders. The massacres and atrocities in Bucha, Mariupol and many other places are real war crimes. Those who are responsible for these terrible crimes and violations need to be held accountable. And, dear Mr. Minister, I thank you very much for your initiative regarding Hague process. I think Putin has to be brought to Hague and not to another place. Russia's cruel war against Ukraine is a total breach with the civilized world and an assault on international law and basic principles of the international order, like sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that makes the world less safe. This is why it is not only an attack against Ukraine, it's an attack against us all. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the world became a different one. It has a profound and lasting impact for European and global security. On the 2nd of March, 141 countries of the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the resolution that demanded that Russia withdraws all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within the internationally recognized borders. We should not forget this. Putin's continuous escalatory nuclear threats and rhetoric are enormously irresponsible and destabilizing. We will counter together the Kremlin and Belarus attempts to destroy the foundations of our international security and stability. For years, ladies and gentlemen, Putin was lying to everyone, to all Western heads of state and government, and even to his own people and soldiers. Only one time he was not lying, when he spoke about his imperial ambitions to rebuild the Soviet Union. I often said, when I was standing here in this auditorium, that I remember quite well how he said at his State of the Nation address on the 25th of April 2005 that the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. For me, it was not the biggest catastrophe. That was a great day, that was a great event, and a great moment in the history of Europe, as many countries were able to get free of communism and were free to throw off the yoke of communism. And many joined the Euro-Atlantic structures like your country, 2004, EU and NATO. And that was a great moment in our history. In his bizarre speeches on the 21st and 24th of February, he falsely declared that Ukraine wouldn't have any legitimacy as a nation state, and its cultural heritage would be an inalienable part of Russia's own history, culture, and principal space. A clear word. Of course, Ukraine has undoubtedly a manifold, unique history and culture by its own. Further, his wrong claims about NATO and its expansion towards NATO enlargement was never meant as a project against anyone. Every nation, and I will state this here very clearly, every nation has a right to choose freely its own alliances without any fear, any interference from others. So we welcome Finland and Sweden if they want to join the alliance soon. I think, Mr. Minister, maybe at the weekend they will make a first step of decision. NATO enlargement was and is a project for peace, for stability and democracy. We know how afraid Putin is to have democratic structures and countries around him. That is his problem, not NATO. We should not forget. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia's invasion in Ukraine is a total turning point in world history and the history of NATO and its member states. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called it a Zeitenwende, a turning point, change of times. On the 27th of February, 3 days after the invasion, at the German parliament, a historic shift of Germany's foreign and defense policy and fundamental change in the strategic outlook. For decades, Germany's policy was not to supply lethal weapons to crisis zones, but the delivery of weapons to Ukraine to defend its country. I welcome Linus Linkevičius. Welcome here, my friend. Okay. The delivery of weapons to Ukraine to defend its country and people against Russian armed forces was and is the only right decision. You can't fight against Putin without weapons. After a time of hesitation, Germany finally starts to support Ukraine not only financially and with humanitarian aid, but also with heavy military. Recently, on the 1st of May, a few days ago, Chancellor Scholz clearly stated it must seem cynical to a citizen of Ukraine when he is told to defend himself against Putin's aggression without weapons. It's out of date, he said. And he added, we will not allow borders to be moved by force and territories to be conquered. And I think this is the right way to help Ukraine with all necessary means. Your country, Lithuania, reacted immediately after the invasion and was one of the first countries that delivered weapons, amongst others artillery capability and ammunition and many more, to Ukraine, respect to this. To deliver quickly heavy weapons of immediate use to Ukraine and the ring swap by NATO states, this is an important step. I strongly welcome and welcomed in this regard the meeting on the Ramstein base in Germany on the 26th of April, where a group of 40 allies inside and outside of NATO discussed how to better coordinate bolstering Ukraine's defense capabilities. Everyone who says that we provoke and threaten Russia by sending more and more weapons to Ukraine is wrong. Putin is acting independently from that and finds wrong narratives and false justifications for everything he wants to do, as he always did in the past. After the illegal annexation of Crimea in March 2014, we continued in NATO our double approach of deterrence through military strength and political dialogue. But Russia was and is not interested in dialogue. I still can hear the strong words of warning of my Lithuanian friends. I start with you, Linas. You always warned looking to Putin. I think of my colleagues, Raza Yuknevichina, Petros Ostrevichus, Audronis Azubalis, I met him this morning in my hotel, and many, many more. You all were right. Lithuania were right. The Baltic states were right. But if I remember the discussions in NATO Parliamentary Assembly, then I remember that many of my colleagues didn't listen carefully. Sometimes they laughed. I did not. I listened carefully. And you know, I always stood at your side. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, for decades, Europe, and especially Germany, built up a strong dependency on Russia's coal, gas, and oil, even though it was clearly obvious since years and years how reckless Putin and the Kremlin behaved. He led a brutal war in Chechnya. He attacked Georgia in 2008. I was there 6 weeks later. He led a military intervention in Syria. You remember Aleppo. Illegally annexed Crimea, 2014. And murdered critics and opposition leaders in and outside Russia, even in Germany, in the Tiergarten. Again, Lithuania acted decisively and became the first country, if I see right, in the European Union that gained independence from Russian gas supplies. You already made years back the right decision for a coherent energy policy. Germany, and I stated clearly here, made a big mistake to get too dependent on Russian gas, oil, and coal for a long time, and even, and I couldn't imagine this, on gas storages. Now, there's a break. The government is working intensively, day and night, to get less and less dependent on Russian energy. Within weeks, in a very short time, we have reduced our dependency of Russian oil from 35% to 12%. And now we support the EU import ban of Russian oil. The German government has also announced to work intensively to need less Russian gas. And we have reduced our independency from 55% to 35%, and we do our utmost to get rid of Russian energy forever in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, looking to NATO, we'll need a global response and a unified answer. In the light of Russia's war, the US and Europe and many more countries decided to impose massively sanctions against Russia, which meanwhile have clearly an enormous impact on the economical situation and on the whole country. To continue to impose more and more sanctions on Russia is a must regarding the massive escalations in Ukraine and new threats to Moldova. Let me look to NATO's eastern flank. We need stronger defense and deterrence. The question is today, is NATO, and that is the issue and the theme of today, is NATO up to the challenge? My answer is yes, we are. After Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, NATO acted united and decisively to send a strong signal to the Kremlin. Every single centimeter within NATO territory will be defended by all 30 allies. NATO leaders clearly stated, as I always said on the NATO hearings here, Article 5 is carved in stone. At an extraordinary summit on the 24th of March, NATO heads of state and government clearly addressed Russia's aggression. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO activated its defense plans. It means the alliance has deployed elements of the NATO response for about, I think, 40,000 under direct NATO command. I strongly welcome that NATO decided to send 4 additional multinational battle groups to Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Slovakia. Now we have multinational troops in 8 countries in the eastern part of NATO's territory, including the Baltic states and Poland, for the first time, I think, in our history. With the NATO multinational Corps Northeast in Stettin, under the lead of Commander Lieutenant General von Sandrath, we are prepared to defend every part of NATO territory. With activating NATO's defense plans and deploying additional troops, it is once more clear that an attack against one member state will always be an attack against all allies. We clearly maintain credible deterrence and defense. It sends a strong message for Putin that there is a big red line, and he should recognize this red line, that NATO will not allow to be crossed. Our alliance stands ready to defend each member at any time. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 days before Russia started its brutal invasion in Ukraine on the 14th of February, the first contingent of German troop reinforcements and additional military vehicles arrived in Rukla as a clear signal of Allied cohesion and common responsibility. The enhanced forward presence battle group is ready to defend together with your great soldiers here in Lithuania, to defend Lithuanian territory whenever needed. At present, there are around 1,000 German soldiers and 1,600 soldiers altogether stationed here in your country. Together with the Lithuanian Iron Wolf Brigade, the battle group is advancing interoperability and exercising its combat readiness. I clearly support Lithuanians and other countries' request to expand the battle groups of NATO's enhanced forward presence into forward presence brigades. I think we have to speak about this, but I think that is a very good and real request. The head of states and governments need to decide on reshaping the forces on the eastern flank of NATO at their upcoming Madrid summit in June. I'm very pleased that Lithuania and Germany are working together so closely, and I thank you for providing an exceptional, Mr. Minister, host nation support for our troops in Rukla and Pabradė. I assure you, Lithuania will never stand alone. We will always be at your side. A few words to investing in defense and security. We often spoke about that. Let me come to another important point. It has always been clear that deterrence and reassurance could only work if it is credible through increase of defense spending, higher readiness of capable forces, and more coordinated investments in new and modern weapon systems. The Defence Investment Pledge set the goal. Wales, September 2014, set the goal of spending 2% of GDP on defense within 10 years, 2024. Investments clearly increased in Europe. That's right. With regard to the promise of collective defense, many European countries have already made their marks. So let me turn to your country. Lithuania became a role model and raised its defense budget to 2.52 meanwhile, and you even want to increase to 3% until 2025. I think respect for this. There is no doubt that all NATO members have to do more. Allies stepped up their budgets for security and defense significantly in the past years. Germany too, but it is not enough. We cannot afford any cuts anymore and need to strengthen on the capabilities of our forces and invest in new weapon systems. Within weeks, Germany decided a special 100 billion euro fund to defense investments and pledged to meet the NATO defense spending target of 2% from this year, starting from this year onwards. I think that is a right and a clear and a good message you have waited for, I know. It is absolutely crucial for all of us that we bundle our forces in Europe more effectively to clearly strengthen the European pillar within the alliance. Looking to NATO Summit in Madrid. The upcoming NATO Summit on the 29th and 30th of June is definitely one of the most important summits since NATO was founded in 1949. We decide a new strategic concept. We have to adopt a new strategic concept which will adapt the alliance to a more dangerous strategic reality and the complex geopolitical environment of today. And if you look to the last strategic concept that was in Lisbon, and I participated to this time as president of NATO Parliamentary Assembly in the beginning of this summit, they were referring to Russia as a strategic partner. And we didn't mention China. So the reality is totally different today. The strategic concept 2022 must clearly set the new direction of NATO, with aggressive Russia as a principal threat to our Euro-Atlantic security. So deterrence and defense must be highlighted. We need to strengthen our presence and station, and that is my position, and I will listen to that, what you are saying. Our presence and station permanent, substantial combat forces. Russia violated all international agreements in the past years. So, we have to think about the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Linus and Mr. Vice Minister, we have so often spoken about this. We kept this treaty. But I think after the violation of Russia all the times in Georgia, in the Crimea annexation, we should think of the question if NATO-Russia Founding Act is obsolete in these days. Due to Russia's unacceptable nuclear threats, we need to reaffirm the importance of nuclear deterrence in the strategic concept. We should have a 360-degree approach to be ready to fight against threats from any direction, especially against international terrorism. We have to step up our means to fight against disinformation, and you know what that means here, especially in this region, and cyber attacks. And, ladies and gentlemen, if you see to the cruel war of Russia against Ukraine, that has so many consequences. Especially, it worsens the situation for the poorest people in the world in Africa, as Ukraine is one of the leading exporters of wheat. And looking to nuclear disarmament, which country should be ready to give up their nuclear weapons in the future? We had the Budapest Agreement, that Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons to Russia. And they got a clear statement for their territorial integrity. And Russia destroyed this paper, destroyed everything what itself has signed. Last point, China. In the past more than 3 months, we had to experience how China did not clearly condemn Russia's war in Ukraine, joined Russia in stating its opposition to NATO's enlargement and criticized Western sanctions instead. NATO definitely needs to find an answer to China in its strategic concept. We need to closely monitor China and its potential challenges in a political, economic, and technological manner. And we need to reduce and avoid any further dependency of European states from China. Undoubtedly, China poses a great challenge to Euro-Atlantic security and to our rules-based order. Conclusion. Mr. Valentinavichus, Mr. Professor Magnificent. Ladies and gentlemen, let me once more clear. Putin will not intimidate us. The Kremlin will not divide us. Russia will and has to lose this war. The history of Europe in the 20th century has taught us, amongst many things, peace and security don't come for free. We all need to continue to work together closely and support each other whenever needed. To be a member of NATO is an insurance. No member country of the alliance has ever been attacked by another state, but we cannot take this for granted. We all together need to do our utmost to deter violent Russia and any other country whoever tries to attack us. I am looking forward now to the statements of our great panelists. I am looking to our discussion. Nurjerjay de koyu ush yusu demesi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karl, very much for this panoramic view of the strategic choices NATO is facing. The key notions here are turning point. NATO is up to the challenge. Putin is about lies, and a fundamental survey of NATO Russia founding act. And also Karl dwelt over the fundamental change in the disposition of German government in all that. And we must be true to Karl. Karl was much ahead of his own government, and he was speaking the way he speaks now, years before German government started to speak, to use the same language. And Dr. Lamer's NATO hearings, 4 editions of them, are the witnesses to consistency of our keynote speaker. Now we start with the panel, and first to speak is Mantas Adomėnas, who once upon a time studied philosophy at Blackfriars College in Oxford. He was reflecting over philosophical problems of freedom and peace in Thomas Aquina's writings, I believe. And now he ended up in being forced to deal with those problems of freedom and peace in a very practical way, in a very difficult situation. So, Mantas, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I not only sort of studied classics, but I also teach classics, and I teach early Roman Empire, Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. And there's not a lot that Mr. Putin can teach us after that, but still some things are new. Well, it's very hard to respond really to such an eloquent contribution by Professor Lammers. I mean, really, and it's not just a rhetorical sort of figure of speech, because you basically said many things that I wanted and marked for myself to say. So it's you know, in many instances, you know, sort of I wanted to sort of wag fingers. I told you so, and you know, and others just sit back and sort of, you know, and let you sort of, you know, do things much more well and convey points much more eloquently than I could ever hope to. I think this perhaps conference should be renamed sort of Cassandra's Forum, because you saw what was coming in Putin in 2005 State of the Union address. To me, the moment of sort of insight was the 2007 Munich Security Conference speech, which I remember the reactions then. I mean, sort of quite a few of our Western colleagues were thinking of Putin when he said all this, sort of set out all his program for restoration of the Soviet sort of empire, as you know, this is a sort of a resentful, disaffected teenager who is trying to grab his elders' attention by saying outrageous things, and you know, and the reaction was, you know, to pat him on the back and say, there, it will all be fine, we'll take care of you, but not realizing, sort of as we chillingly did, that actually this was his serious program of action, which we now finally see implemented to the full extent. So just a few words about sort of nature of Putin's attack on humanity. I mean, it's not just a sort of return of the zero-sum game politics in a big way. I mean, any illusions that we could have had of this sort of mutually assisting and sort of mutually sort of beneficial progress in vis-a-vis sort of Russia has been sort of laid to rest for a long time, and I think this is the realization of that coming from an unlikely quarter, the German president, who said that, you know, the ideal of the common home with Russia has now been finally scrapped, or some words to that effect. I think this is also a grave to this notion that, you know, in the continent of Europe we can sort of for the first time in history create a different type of politics, this sort of not the zero-sum game, but a kind of, you know, sort of mutually sort of enriching and mutually sort of beneficial. It is not just an attempt to reinstate the concept of privileged influence zones, which again is something that international law and United Nations was supposed to sort of remove this temptation that but we see that as a sort of as a guiding strategic concept in this war of Ukraine, that while Russia perceives as casus belli the fact that it's been deprived of its privileged influence zones, which I think is also very worrying, its implications. It's also sort of an attack on the sort of an attempt to dramatically transform the strategic security balance in Europe, which has been more or less sort of stable for the last decades, and reaching further back, even sort of in its fundamental principles, also to the end of the Second World War. So this is again sort of the beginning of the processes which may not finish at the limits of the borders and boundaries of the continent. Let alone its nullification of international norms pertaining to war. And I think Professor Lamerse was very eloquent on that. But also much more. I think for the first time, after a long time, we see the return to ideological war. Return of ideological war, and when we say that Putinism is Nazism of the 21st century, it's not just kind of a soundbite which is meant to kind of to denigrate your opponent. It's a sort of it's a clinically precise sort of diagnosis that we see once again the sort of war which is motivated by ideological constructs, which allows Kremlin to totally disregard all sort of rational calculi in the conduct of the war, which allows it to disregard all norms to which it should be subject as sort of impositions that limit the full scope of its sort of righteous sort of project of restoring the military might and glory, and it also leads to genocidal practices which are justified by sort of the ideological constructs. So really we see sort of and what we should be worried about is that this sort of ideological warfare faces sort of annihilation with equanimity, and sort of even if it's sort of even its annihilation of its own citizens, or even its own statehood. And when we saw from the Putin's ideologists saying that sort of threatening with nuclear strikes and faced with the possibility of retaliation, that we'll all die, but at least we'll go to heaven, whereas you will just perish like dogs, or something to that effect. This is okay, maybe the exaggerated ideological trope, but nevertheless it is a sort of expression of this ideological sort of warfare. Also, weaponization of civil institutions, which is it's already implicit in what I've said, but has the potential to globalize the conflict in unexpected ways. I mean, we saw at an early stage of the war some sort of manipulations of nuclear power plants, possibly with some hostile intent. Maybe that danger has receded with the retake of Chernobyl by the Ukrainian forces, but nevertheless there seems to have been an intention to use nuclear energy sources for some sort of hostile intent. Manipulation of information and abuse of the freedom of speech in the West, this is needless to say. Energy terrorism, again, that has been addressed at great length, and we see how it was planned well ahead of the time. The inflated, depleted storage of energy resources and inflated prices in order to use this as a weapon, and sort of migrant flows, which again, sort of, even though employed by Belarus, it clearly followed the textbooks created by Russia in 2015 against Finland and Norway. And last, what you also mentioned is food security. I mean, the denial of grain exports from Ukraine is fraught with sort of creating a phenomenon on a scale sort of unseen before, and sort of, probably unseen since Holodomor, and threatens precisely the developing countries, which are sort of put in a position where they could be blackmailed in that respect. Now, when it comes to NATO, before the war, NATO's position probably was sort of at its weakest point for a number of years. I mean, sort of, I don't need to go into the failure at Bucharest in 2008, which directly led to invasions of Georgia and Ukraine, and the abject failure to respond adequately to those invasions, 2008 and 2014. There were also sort of rise of isolationism under President Trump, and responding sort of increasingly plausible talk of European strategic autonomy. On the other side, well, luckily this was begun to be mended before the war, but now it is the case that probably NATO has never looked so hale and robust for a long time. We see Western European members who have long relied on sort of there being in a sort of secure spot of the continent rearming and modernizing their equipment. You spoke at length about Germany's changing its strategic posture. There is an imminent expansion of NATO alliance, but nevertheless, what we need to do is well, again, you really put all the words on the table, which I was going to say, that we need to replace deterrence as the sort of governing concept with standing defense capabilities, and the war against Ukraine showed us exactly what types of military threats we should defend against. We need anti-A2AD capabilities here in Lithuania, which is overlooked on both sides by sort of Russian military installations, not just from the east, but I've repeated that joke quite a few times, but you know, sort of when people don't know where Lithuania is, I tell them Russia is our western neighbor. And this is something that unites us with Japan, I think. That they immediately start thinking that's somewhere sort of, you know, far east, but no, it's the Kaliningrad, which is usually overlooked. But so we really need sort of defense against that. But we also have to realize that the scope of assault is much broader than sort of merely military. I already sort of outlined these ways of how civil institutions are being weaponized. And in order to address that, sort of a broad network of allies is needed, and a global response, as Professor rightly said. We see that already in the sort of sanctions mechanisms, which is joined by our friends and allies from far beyond the confines of NATO and European Union. So this is a working network of democratic countries which are actively sort of invested in the need to maintain international rules-based international order. Needs to be sort of further promoted, this cooperation further deepened and coordinated. Yesterday I was at a seminar talking about economic Article 5. That's primarily in response to China's, but also in response to economic coercion from other authoritarian states. And that's, again, a sort of a concept which I think is very important when we see the weaponization of economic tools, weaponization of energy. We need to develop these capabilities of resisting. And primarily to realize that what we are facing here is not a short-term threat which can be easily seen off. And democracies, they do have this inbuilt propensity to attention deficit disorder. I mean, as soon as there is a new, more thrilling sort of phenomenon on the books, we tend to forget, but people keep dying. Territory will be sort of kept sort of, attempted by the Russian military, and we need to maintain this sort of strategic sort of patience of resisting in a very, what possibly can be a very long conflict. And for that, NATO is the only institution which I see that it can ensure this long-term orientation, which will crystallize all our efforts in returning to this global attempt to respond to the encroachment of authoritarianisms on the rules-based international order. Thank you.
Thank you, Mantas. I think very nice classical touch with Caligula. But major takeaway from Mantas' speech is that Putin's fascism is not a rhetorical figure anymore. It is a fact of life, and we need to act upon that. And Mantas went through the range of practical issues which could be followed. And the ending is a quite stark warning that it will be a long-haul affair which asks for strategic patience. Now, Linas Linkevičius, twice defense minister, twice foreign affairs minister. I think you hold record on that. But sheer numbers, they are just numbers. Behind them, there are decades of experience at policy making in security and international issues on the highest level. So Karl said that the Lithuanians were right, and pointing figure at you too. Now, my question would be, what about Lithuanians are right now?
Thank you, Virgis, and thank you, Karl, for your introductory statement. And most of all, thank you for your principled and tough position, consistent position through all these difficult times. I'm always fond when big people are in charge, you know, it's always more reliable. Well, but when talking today, we celebrated Europe Day yesterday, and we really have something to celebrate. We're also enjoying security guarantees provided by NATO. It's really something to enjoy. And we know that this is something very important, meaningful. It was not given just by itself. It should be fought for. And those who know, they know that it was not so easy to achieve. But now we're even more maybe sensitive to the developments in the countries like Ukraine or others. And we're looking at lessons not learned. I'm always now when meeting audiences, and now I'm back from Kaunas, from one of the schools. We had very interesting discussions about the future of Europe, but it's impossible to isolate European Union from other organizations, be it NATO or United Nations, international community at large. Are we really capable to withstand all these threats and challenges now we are facing? Are we really not just, it's very nice that our colleagues recognizing that we were right, but it's not enough. It's important not to repeat these mistakes. It's important to be consistent again. And I'm not sure that that will take place, that will happen. That's what I'm really concerned. And when we're talking back about these years, through these years where we're developing last security concept, I remember quite well. But Karl, it was not so easy. You mentioned Russia was mentioned as strategic partner, but we were insisting not to name Russia like that, I remember. We said it's not strategic partner. How it could be strategic partner when it violates everything around, right? And we insisted to amend, and that happened. You can check your text if you want. It's mentioned that Russia, relations with Russia of strategic importance. So we agreed on that consensus, which is more rightly so. And that was in 2010. And then through all these years, these lessons not learned, and especially in 2008, I would say, reaction was right. Reaction was tough. And that was not just poetry, you know, condemning what we are very gifted to do. But we really outlined very concrete requirements what Russia must do, what we insist Russia to do, what we really demand Russia to do, or hope Russia will do, in order to get back to business as usual. And was never happened, never happened. And 20% of territory of Georgia remained to be occupied. And when we now surprised some of our colleagues about Ukraine, and why Russians so treating Ukraine, humiliating and even denying existence. Again, let me remind 2008, speech of Putin during NATO-Russia Council, where I was present, I remember quite well. And maybe you were, Karl, as well at that time. And Putin was teaching NATO leaders guys, with whom you're cooperating? You're cooperating with a country which is not existing. It's an artificial creation. It's not a country even. And everybody was surprised, looking at each other. And I already told to some audience that at that time, former Danish Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen, future Secretary General of NATO, spoke on behalf of NATO leaders, saying, Mr. President, it's not the way we are talking about our partners. You know, we're not used to that. And again, in the couloirs, during the break, they were just asking why he said this. And there were a few of us, minority handful, saying that he means that. That's exactly what he treats these countries as a backyard. Sphere of influence sounds quite eloquent, but in reality, this is space of their, so to say, ownership. And that, I would remind, 2008, it was not Ukraine at that time. In few months after the meeting took place, and we rejected to give membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine. We again insisted to do. We said that it would be provocative not to give the membership action plan, but our opponents, including, sorry to mention, you know whom, said no, it will be provocative to give membership action plan. And it happened. War started in South, Caucasus. It was not Crimea at that time, but we mentioned. I remember I mentioned Crimea myself. Mentioned Crimea will come, other frozen conflict will be woke up, and we will face even bigger problem. So these lessons were learned by Russia, because price was agreeable, acceptable, manageable. Why not? You can occupy or so to say territory of a foreign country, and that would be very agreeable price, not too difficult. Even now they expected that these sanctions will not be so painful, but they didn't believe. It was too much for them, but nevertheless they still encouraging each other that it's okay, it's manageable, and everything will be settled down, and that will be the case. So I believe this is very important now to understand what's going on, and being proud of our alliance, of our unity, which is definitely the case. But let's ask ourselves how we managed to get to that point when we grown this aggressor to the situation where they can blackmail all world, basically, undermine all security system we created, and again looking for some concessions, looking for exceptions for special treatment, and expecting that he will be listened. Now, again, it's impossible to talk just about NATO. We have to see bigger picture. Now we have comments from some leaders, European leaders, about Ukraine that I'm always saying this poetry that Ukraine is in our heart is nice. Ukraine is our heart, is our so to say, family. But when it comes to transfer that to the legal language, they must be given candidate status. Not membership, candidate. And it takes time. We know the history. We know how long it for Turkey. One can say it will never happen. Some say it will happen, but they still have this candidate status, right? Or Serbia, but not associating themselves with European security policy, but still they opened, I believe, 18 chapters, closed 2 and whatever. So it's in the process. It takes time, many years. But in order to start, you have to start. And now it will be test for our unity, for our nice words, for this poetry. And very soon, I expect that Commission will come up with the recommendation to start these negotiations in June. I hope so. But it will be again saying by member states. And that will be the answer. Coming back to Madrid summit, for me it's very interesting how this language will look like. You remember, and Mantas and everyone, since 2008, although we rejected membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine, but we agreed, and there is a sentence saying that Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO, full stop. There was also discussion, I remember, let's add if they wish so or something, but it was not done. They will be members. Then Ukraine was deleted for some period due to the position of officials. Now it's back again. And again, now it's a question. What will happen? From my sources, I understand that Georgians will not ask to remove that. Despite all peculiarities of their domestic policy, and this is not, we're talking today, but this is definitely something very important. What about Ukraine? Looking for other security guarantees, collective, regional, whatever. It's important, and we will see how it will happen. We don't know yet whether there will be declaration or communique or whatever, but that's something we would like to see not changed, at least. Because that would be answer to the blackmailing of Russia. Because one of the demands was that Georgia and Ukraine should never be joining NATO. It's not up to them to decide. So we really have to be consistent and have to keep this principled approach. There are some also, there's no time to talk about everything, but it reminds me that what was led to this situation, as I said, we have now, this is inconsistency, concessions, naivety, I would say, everything. And that's also this so-called dialogue, which is important. Who can deny? Dialogue, it's important. For diplomacy, it's the essence. But if it's not kind of, so to say, assisted by power arguments with the partners like Russia, it means nothing, because it serves for Russia as a smoke screen to do nothing, to change nothing, to continue what they're doing all the time, with the agreeable price, as I said before, and that's not helping. The illusion that you are doing something and there is a progress, it's just illusion. And also I remember our discussions in NATO when it was talks during the presidency of Medvedev. It was exactly during the time when we prepared this strategic concept. It was not just playing with the words, theater missile defense or territorial missile defense, but it was so open-mindedness to talk to Russians. But I remember leaders of NATO and even Secretary General at that time was talking about engaging Russia into territorial missile defense, which essentially, this is Article 5, basically, which is not possible to do for future allies, Sweden and Finland, even if it's not as easy to do. It soon will come, but at that time it's only you cannot outsource, you know, for Article 5 functions. And that was obvious, and I remember at that time I was tried to talking to some colleagues, why we are saying this? Theater missile defense is different. It's operation field, and you really can engage, you have operations, missions, and that could be some cooperation. It happens and taking place, but territorial, too much. But at that time, we also talked with Dmitry Rogozin, who was my colleague, so to say, because he was ambassador of Russia at that time. So we were fighting during the NATO-Russia Council, but we informally talking. And he asked me many times, do you really mean we will share this button, territorial missile defense? I'm not superpower, what I can tell him. I said, I think not. Maybe it will be some exchange of information. I believe some kind of, fusion or whatever. Maybe not that far. but again, coming back to my team and camp, it was just like this. Let's say this. This would be very, very open signal. If you will follow, Medvedev at that time said quite serious, we'll see how NATO is serious to cooperate with Russia. If they will really do that, what they promise, territorial missile defense, then we'll take it seriously. But if not, he knew that it will not happen. So again, as I said, no time for more details, but I'm trying to provide some examples from my experience, and my line would like to draw. This is lessons not learned, not to repeat, and now focus on the regions where really are vulnerable. They're feeling really not confident. I openly can tell again about Georgia, about Ukraine. They need security guarantees. They see what is happening, and you never know what will come to the mind of this not very consistent leader. And these countries are not covered by any guarantees. And if something will happen, again, we will make some statements, we'll be very sorry, but nobody will defend them. And that will be very, very, very bad. So while discussing what we have achieved altogether and being proud and celebrating, let's think what we have to do today in order not to repeat those mistakes. That's.
So, thank you very much, Linas. Linas, from years of his experience, he reflected upon this sense of being right and telling right things was very hard, very difficult job to do over the years. And it looks like it remains difficult. And there will be, this poetry thing to transform it into real action. It takes hard work and many years and consistency and so on. And any serious international framework, institutional framework, is important in that. Yeah, and yes, being right Lithuanian way is a hard work. And for the nearest future, I'm afraid we will have a lot of it. Now, our next speaker is Rima Malakowskina. She has decades of experience in defense policy making in Lithuanian Ministry of Defense. And also you were on diplomatic position in Brussels as well, dealing with the same issues. So, Rima, I'm sorry. Rima, what are you making of all this?
First of all, I would also very much like to thank you for invitation to this conference, and thank you, for the major presenter for a really very interesting, sum up of all the developments. But for myself, when I was reading the name of the conference, and what took me this is NATO Up to the Challenge. And that is something really important to discuss, because I believe when events in Ukraine started, there was a kind of unease, and people were saying, is really NATO doing enough, not enough, why they are not, putting forces up or whatsoever. And for myself, I also would like to have this ideological approach that, yes, we have to do everything right now and everything right. But unfortunately, world is a little bit different, and NATO is a kind of sum of nations. And those nations have different approaches, perspectives, and understandings. And I believe it's very important to understand, why are we, in this difficulty sometimes going to the consensuses. And as Linas was saying, what were those lessons not learned, and what could be actually improved on our side, so we would not repeat ourselves in the same situation. So for myself, I believe the problem was, it has deeper roots. After Second World War, if we look, we had very clear denazification of Germany, but we had another nation which behaved the same, but they went as, winners of the war. So there was no kind of responsibility for previous butchers, because there were a lot of butchers before, but nobody actually was questioning that. And Russian society took this as a right way forward. So therefore, it has, I believe, two important aspects. One aspect is for Russian society. They are not able to heal because they do not understand the wounds and the problems that they have inside. But also the problem on our side, because people on our, in Europe, they do not know history very well, because that part of history was kind of covered. And I believe this is the reason, one of the very important goals for all the universities and scholars, just to uncover that part of history. Why? What was happening? Because, a lot of nations did not receive their independence. There were, as I told, a lot of butchers uncovered. And that needs to be known for us to move forward. Because, if you talk to Europeans, for a lot of people, what is Russia? Russia is, a place for doing business, good money, and a lot of fun, etc., etc. And to transform that in the human's mind, so it needs, a lot of work. I believe, CNN is doing a great job. Universities, all the conferences, this is something that we need to do on our side to make people understand what is happening and why it is so important for us to take steps on our side. Why it is also important, because as previous speakers were saying, it is not a short thing, it will be long run kind of endeavor for all of us. And people get tired pretty soon. And as Mantas was saying, also, we have this attention-keeping disorder, and there will be a lot of, issues that will be going to take our attention away. And Russia is doing very well that with food crisis. Right now, everybody is saying about the possibility of Israel-Iran kind of collision when the Russians are withdrawing. So there are a lot of different possibilities. So for us to keep focus, so we have to prepare our societies, and our societies need to understand why it is so important. They need to understand that this is not about Ukraine. This is not about something far away. This is actually about the very existence of ours, about the freedom, about the democracy, because otherwise we are going to lose those, the most important elements of our societies. As on NATO side, so NATO is doing a lot of things, but it also takes work, because right now even you can hear some people are saying that we need to wait and see. Maybe there will be not that much left of Russia. Well, maybe there will be. So I'm really very skeptic about that kind of approach, because I believe we are not going to solve a Russian problem pretty soon, and on NATO side also it takes a lot of years and preparation and consensus building to move forward. So therefore we have to do what needs to be done and start right now. And what was Minister alluding to, I believe NATO needs to move to this forward defense. Because we started talking about that already before war in Ukraine. For us, it was, Belarus that ringed a lot of bells in our heads when we saw that Russia is moving right to our borders. And that changes everything dramatically. You understand that, this idea that you have tripwire and reinforcements will be coming is actually not working very well, because there will be no time. You are not having time to prepare, so you have to be able to move immediately. And why it is, because, we have very clear understanding in this part of the world, and this is modus operandi of Russia, that they are looking for the possibilities as a thieves. So if they have 2 seconds to grab something, they go grab and then say, let's sit and negotiate. And, and that is difficult approach on our side, because, if they would be able to grab any kind of land of light territories, so negotiation with the nuclear power is kind of difficult business. And it's much more expensive, because it's always cheaper to defend rather to let somebody to do something and then, retake, renegotiate, or do something else. So therefore, our primary goal for Madrid that is approaching is this forward defense, as we understand. Not in the old terms that, you would be moving huge forces to the front line. There would be not even space to do that, and there is no need with modern technologies. But certainly thicken this tripwire, as you, Mr. Lamerts, told very rightly. We are very much looking for battalions to be increased to the brigades with all the enablers, but we are also talking about the right positioning of forces, because reinforcement needs to be very, very quick. Russia needs to see that they do not have even those 2 seconds to get in and do something. And that also takes other domains, air defense, as was mentioned, maritime sector, and deep precision strikes. So Russia needs to know that, they might have trouble back home if they dare to do something. So we would not be, concentrating as right now what they are doing mostly and fighting on Lithuanian soil, on Ukrainian soil. No, actually, if you dare, so you will be facing consequences. And we believe this is the most important element of deterrence, and we need to put all our efforts in making sure that it is, coming true. As for strategic concepts, of course, I believe it's very important that we actually name things right ways. So Russia is a long-term threat for the alliance, because sometimes you still can hear people saying that, no, maybe it will pass, maybe we should look forward, and it will be, again, bright and good. Maybe, but if that changes appear, we are always able to come together and make another strategic concept. But I believe for the foreseeable future, that is not going to change. Of course, we are very much looking for Belarus to be included in strategic concept, because Belarus is kind of part of the Russia, so you cannot ignore, and you can, and it makes a lot of a big change and big difference from security perspective of our region. And China was touched upon as well, and I believe it's very important also element for everybody to consider, because sometimes people are thinking that, you can't have possibility to choose either China or Russia. But it's not going to go that way, because at least I personally believe that US alone cannot deal with China. They need Europeans, but Europeans can, come to aid when they are safe and secure. When they are safe and secure, when there is no threat from Russia. So more or less, you have to deal with both those challenges simultaneously. They are all very different in nature, but we have to find instruments and make sure that we are not threatened by neither side of this equilibrium. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think the major point was that there is a problem of historic mentality, that Russia is a country which never regretted anything, which never did a soul search, and that means all the problems caused by this mentality are rather long-term, and unequivocally, the last point, Russia is threat number one, unconditionally. And thank you. Now, in line we have Dovilė Jakniūnaitė, professor from Vilnius University. She has several books under her belt, including a book In Search of NATO in Lithuania, I believe. So you represent science and objectivity here. Is it possible to have scientific perspective on all that?
So good day. I'll try not to take all the time which we have left. And so thank you very much, Virginia, for inviting and all the university team for organizing this event so effectively. And thanks, Professor Lammers, for this lecture and this reflection on the conditions which led us to this situation and also what you think it's possible to do. And I think all the speakers here very clearly covered ground on why we came to this situation and especially what we have to do. So when I thought what I can tell you maybe to reflect more on the challenges we have now on the ground. And no, I don't think that I'm objective, and I don't believe in objectivity in science in general, because we have like a lot of values, and we are speaking from some kind of position. I, of course, speak as a Lithuanian here, and you can't avoid that anywhere when you come here or outside. So yesterday, I don't know how many of you watched the speech, the so awaited speech by Putin on the occasion of May 9th, but I did that because it was it was interesting what he would say, and I think it's very of course parade was not so exciting, not as exciting as several years ago, but the speech I think still was important, because what we heard was that Putin very clearly, obviously tried to connect victory in Second World War, Russian victory, of course it is, with the current situation in Ukraine, which he didn't mention any war happening, any special operation, but he clearly connected what's happening now with what happened in Second World War, and this kind of it was very clear connection, and it was very clear connection and implication that we won last war, that important war in Second World War, so we will win this war as well. And this kind of, I think this kind of rhetorical connection made for us, at least should made very clearly for Russian listeners, and also I think for us, that he is not prepared to retreat. He is thinking about victory, and his main, he built all his career for this, and this narrative, long built narrative of the country, which has only one positive idea about themselves winning big war. And no, it's impossible to lose. It's impossible to have anything else than to portray as a victory. It doesn't matter what kind of victory it is, but still, it's definitely not what it is now. And in this context, I think it's also quite important to not to congratulate us too much about what we did already in this context, because as already Mantas Adomėnas and Rima Malakowskina already said, that everything is not finished yet, And it will take a long time. And when I look, for example, and I see a couple of tensions, for example, how we talk about current situation. First, when we talk about like European or NATO contribution, of course, it's very important to stress, and it is important that solidarity was demonstrated, especially for Eastern flank, so-called NATO flank for us, and also for Ukraine. And I totally agree it's unprecedented, and nobody expected that Germany will change its rhetoric so quickly. In first week it happened. But also we always have to remember that there are always limits of solidarity. And I don't imply here that, for example, like Germany or other states that are very dependent on oil should refuse oil like immediately. We have some voices that say like stop, we should stop now. It's like, of course, you have to understand domestic implications of that. But talking about limits, when states are prepared to say that maybe sanctions are enough, these sanctions, just wait for sanctions, how will start to work, or maybe this kind of danger about already now to talk about what kind of face-saving measures can be for Russia, which could stop war, for example. I think it's quite dangerous because it puts everyone who's talking like that, especially from official position, already in position of defeat. You can think that, of course, and maybe it's the right thing to do, but I think rhetorically it's not. It shows limits again of solidarity with Ukraine, and this kind of tension is still not solved, I guess, and it's more not in the context of NATO, I guess, but more in the European Union context. And for example, and second, I think tension is also important. Yes, about how we treat Russia's actions. Yes, Russia definitely didn't reach its goal in Ukraine. It lost a battle for Kiev, let's say. It had to retreat it, and now it's like still, like it was demonstrated how pretty, not weak, but still pretty weak or not prepared its army is, and logistically it was poor planning. There was definitely everything on the ground, but still we have so many people, we still don't know how many people died in Ukraine, so many cities destroyed, infrastructure, like no road. After war we have no road. Ukraine didn't have much good roads before war, but now there will be no roads and no infrastructure. And Ukraine, we didn't say that, but Ukraine several times already promised not to ask for NATO membership. It's also cost of war. And now we will definitely see long positional war in eastern Ukraine, and that will take a long time. And also that's again a question of how much attention we are prepared to pay there. And so when I think it's maybe it's Lithuanian context, but I very often read that congratulatory rhetoric that Russia is losing. It's like dead state and it's failed state, but actually we see like strong position in certain territories of Russia, in Ukraine, and it's actually still able to create unstable situation for a long time in our region. That's definitely, I think, we should even prepare for that. And my final point, it's about, Professor Lamerso, you mentioned that this war was of historical importance, and I think it's important. But then but also Matas Dominas mentioned that global response is needed, and I think it would be very good to realize that actually this war is war for West against Russia. When we see on a global scale, on global reactions, yes, we see that United Nations resolutions were passed, and many states voted against Russia. But when we see who joined sanctions, which states condemned clearly, we see mostly Western states or American partners in Pacific. And actually, I would say that it's like global South definitely took, also the states in Latin America, and Africa, and Asia definitely took position. Let's wait and see. and we must not get involved. And there are many reasons for that, and independence, and history, and also skepticism towards the United States foreign policy. But I think it's also very important, even sitting here in the region, understanding that how important for us is this question, to understand that it's not global issue. That's European security issue, definitely, and many parts in the world treat like that. And I don't know if it should be different, but I think this understanding about requirements, what all the world should do, we should remember that the world is not necessary for many different reasons, and justifiable for them not prepared to pay too much attention to Ukraine as we are doing.
Thank you, Dovile, for the honest answer about science and objectivity. But I think you spoke powerfully on behalf of realism, what's really taking place on the ground, and there were a lot of very strong points against being over-optimistic in all this. Thank you very much. Now, I think we ran out of time to allow questions from the audience, so we will move to the conclusion. I would ask every participant just for 1 minute of ending remarks, if it's possible. If you do not need that, we could proceed with our next point. Now, is Veronika Horčáková here? Okay, please come here. Now, I must do some explaining. Karl Lammers is not only our keynote speaker at our hearings, Dr. Lammers hearings. He is also the founder of Lammers Peace Foundation, which the foundation funds a student essay contest every year. And here we have Veronika Horčáková, the winner of last year's student essay contest and proud owner of 1,000 euros prize money, which was donated by Karl Foundation. Now, Karl.
Yeah, dear Birgis, dear Veronika, when I founded my Peace Foundation in 2018, it was my aim to encourage young people to think about the great importance of peace and freedom in our world. Now, in these dark times, and we have spoken about this today more than ever before, it is essential for us to win the hearts and the minds, especially of young people. I have always known that I would like to start the essay competition at the Mykolo Romerio University. Magnificent, excuse me, I always say my university here, in Vilnius, followed by competitions in the framework of NATO parliamentary assemblies, so for 30 member states, and competitions for schools in my former constituency, and meanwhile for students in the University of Heidelberg too. Mykolo Romerio University is an outstanding institution and a flagship for excellence in education, research, and scientific. It gives students great opportunities. So I call on every one of you, our students, our young people here, make the most of it. With my Peace Foundation, I want to further strengthen the great relations between Lithuania and Germany. So, winners of the essay competition in February 2021. The essay competition was launched at your university. The topic was NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg refers to 2021 as a year of opportunity to re-energize transatlantic relations and to strengthen the bond between Europe and North America. What significance would this have for the Baltic states? And how can Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia contribute to strengthen the transatlantic partnership? Birgis, we received many submissions from students. I congratulate all participants for their splendid work. The quality of the papers was excellent again. Professor Virgis Valentinavičius and his team, Rima Malakowskina and Benas Brunadas, were very busy. They are here? Ah, great. They are busy making hard choices. It was not easy to select the 3 winning essays. Let me thank once more, especially you, Virgis Valentinavičius, to chair and coordinate the competition, as well as his whole team, and of course, Rector Professor Jaliniene for their amazing support. The 3 winning essays that will be awarded with the Dr. Karl Lamer's Peace Prize today are: third prize, that means €400. The third prize goes to Arnoldas Rutkauskas, Master Student of International Law. He is not able to be here, but I think Virgis will say a few words. The essay provides a broad geopolitical context augmented with fresh material, such as the latest Lithuanian policies on Taiwan and China. Congratulations to him and all the best for his studies. The second prize and the winner is Oles Zahan, Erasmus student at the Mykolo Romerio University. He takes a commendably strong stand in supporting Atlantism as a bedrock of feasible security in the Baltic region, as well as in the region of eastern neighborhood of the EU. Congratulations to him, to the second prize. And now to you. First prize. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come now to the winner. The first prize goes to Veronika Horšáková, Master Student of European and International Business Law. You delivered an open-minded and honest account of Baltic involvement in NATO, framed in a broad historic, political, economic context. Your essay excels in critical thinking and in profound understanding of complexity of challenges Baltic states face. Deliberation on modern info warfare and cybersecurity issues is considered especially valuable. Also, the team of experts take note of the quality of the sources that you used, Veronika, in your winning essay. Congratulations, €1,000, and all the best for your further studies. I think the rector will come.
Now, symptomatically, Veronika Horšáková is a MIU student from Ukraine. And also Oles Zahan was not able to come because he's also from Ukraine, and war interrupted with him attending his ceremony. So, yes, please.
To announce today as well that the Essay Competition 22 has already started with the most highly relevant topic, NATO and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, what is the stake for the Baltic countries? I invite you all students of your university here, to submit their essays and take the part in this year's competition. I would be glad if many of you would participate, and you could be one of those who get awarded with a €1,000 prize here in this Peace Foundation. Thank you.
So, thank you all. First of all, big thanks to our keynote speaker and our panelists, the students, professors, university leadership, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, and the representatives of embassies. I think we had a very productive and insightful debate. And I think the top line of the debate could be less poetry, more business in support for Ukraine. And I wish to see you next May in our 6th annual NATO, Dr. Lamer's NATO Hearings. Thank you very much.